Keep that crying baby quiet, or I'll have you both removed from this aircraft. The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like ice as she loomed over the exhausted black mother, trying to soothe her fussy 6-month-old daughter. When 28-year-old Keisha Williams looked up to explain that her baby was teething, and she was doing her best to calm her, the flight attendant's response was swift and shocking. The sharp crack of the slap echoed to the first-class cabin as passengers gasped in horror. You people need to learn some respect and control your children properly. But what this arrogant flight attendant didn't know was that the quiet man sitting 3 rows behind them, calmly working on his laptop, was Michael Williams, Keisha's husband, and the owner of Apex Airlines. In exactly 18 minutes, when he stood up and revealed his identity, this flight attendant's career wouldn't just be over. Her life would never be the same again. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated so unfairly that it made your blood boil? This story shows what happens when prejudice meets power, and karma arrives with first-class ticket. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, hit that subscribe button right now and comment respect along with where you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness is the most satisfying example of instant justice in aviation history. The morning sun streamed to the windows of Apex Airlines' flagship Boeing 777 as passengers settled into their seats for the cross-country flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. First class was filled with business executives, celebrities, and wealthy travelers who expected nothing less than perfection from the premium service they had paid for. The cabin exuded luxury with its cream leather seats, polished with accents and soft ambient lighting that promised a comfortable journey across the country. Among the first-class passengers was Keisha Williams, a strikingly beautiful woman in her late 20s who carried herself with quiet grace despite the obvious exhaustion of traveling with an infant. She had boarded early with her 6-month-old daughter Zara, taking advantage of the airline's family boarding policy to get settled before the cabin filled with other passengers. Keisha wore a simple but elegant navy dress and carried herself with the understated confidence of someone accustomed to fine things, though nothing about her appearance suggested the extraordinary wealth and power that surrounded her life. What none of the crew members knew as they prepared for departure was that Keisha Williams wasn't just another passenger. She was married to Michael Williams, the founder and CEO of Apex Airlines, the very company whose uniform they wore and whose paychecks they received. Michael had built Apex Airlines from a small regional carrier into one of the most successful and profitable airlines in the world, with a fleet of over 200 aircraft and routes spanning 6 continents. The journey that led to this moment had begun 17 years earlier when Michael was a 25-year-old aircraft mechanic working the night shift at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Born into poverty in rural Alabama, Michael had learned about aviation from his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had worked on bomber engines during the war. Despite having no formal business education, Michael possessed an intuitive understanding of what made airlines succeed or fail, combined with an unwavering work ethic that would eventually transform him from a grease-stained mechanic into one of the most powerful figures in commercial aviation. Michael's breakthrough came when he noticed that smaller regional airlines were consistently failing due to poor maintenance practices and inadequate customer service. While working on various aircraft during his night shifts, he observed patterns of neglect and inefficiency that larger airlines managed to avoid through better systems and training. He began developing ideas for how a regional carrier could compete with major airlines by focusing on reliability, safety, and exceptional customer service rather than trying to match their scale and resources. Using his life savings of $15,000 and a loan secured by his grandfather's small farm, Michael purchased a single-use aircraft and founded Apex Airlines in 2007. The timing was challenging, with the airline industry still recovering from the economic disruptions of the previous decade. But Michael's focus on operational excellence and customer satisfaction quickly distinguished his company from competitors who prioritized cost-cutting over service quality. The early years of Apex Airlines were marked by 18-hour work days, constant financial pressure, and the kind of hands-on leadership that required Michael to personally load baggage, clean aircraft interiors, and even fill in as a flight attendant when staffing shortages demanded it. But his commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or ticket price, created a loyal customer base that sustained the company through its most difficult periods. The couple had met 5 years earlier, when Keisha was working as a pediatric nurse at the Children's Hospital of Atlanta. Michael had been visiting young patients as part of Apex Airlines community outreach program, and he had been immediately drawn to Keisha's compassion, intelligence, and natural warmth with the children. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours, covering everything from her experiences in nursing school to his vision for transforming air travel through better customer service. Their courtship had been intense but private, with Michael going to great lengths to ensure that their relationship developed away from the scrutiny that came with his growing public profile as a successful entrepreneur. He had learned early in his career that media attention could be both beneficial and destructive, and he was determined to protect Keisha from the pressures that came with dating someone whose business decisions were regularly covered in financial news publications. When they married 3 years ago, Michael had insisted that Keisha maintain her career and her independence, supporting her decision to continue working as a nurse even after their daughter was born. He admired her dedication to helping others and understood that her work gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond the material comfort his wealth could provide. The pediatric intensive care unit where Keisha worked was one of the most demanding environments in healthcare, requiring the kind of emotional resilience and technical competence that Michael respected deeply. Today's flight was actually part of a family vacation, their first extended trip together since Zara's birth 6 months earlier. They were traveling to Los Angeles, where Michael would speak at an aviation industry conference, while Keisha and Zara visited her sister, who lived in Santa Monica. Michael had chosen to fly on his own airline to maintain the low profile they preferred when traveling together, and to observe firsthand how his company was performing from a customer's perspective. The lead flight attendant for today's service was Sandra Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the airline industry, who had worked for Apex Airlines for the past 8 years. At 42, Sandra carried herself with a professional authority that came from years of managing demanding passengers and complex service situations. She had worked her way up from economy class to first class through what she considered superior customer service skills and an ability to maintain order in even the most challenging circumstances. Sandra's career trajectory had been shaped by her background and the cultural environment in which she had grown up. Born and raised in a small town in rural Georgia where social hierarchies were rigid and clearly defined, she had learned early in life that respect was something to be earned rather than given freely. Her father had worked for 30 years at a paper mill, while her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families in the county seat. From these experiences, Sandra had absorbed lessons about class, race, and social position that would influence her worldview throughout her adult life. When Sandra entered the airline industry straight out of high school, these attitudes had initially served her well. She had an intuitive understanding of how to read passengers and provide the level of service that different types of travelers expected. Wealthy business executives appreciated her deference and attention to detail. Elderly passengers responded well to her respectful manner and willingness to provide extra assistance. Even demanding celebrities found her professional competence and discretion reassuring. Sandra's background had shaped her worldview in ways that influenced her professional interactions. Growing up in a working-class family in rural Georgia, she had learned early that respect had to be earned and that certain people deserved better treatment than others based on their social status and behavior. When she entered the airline industry, these attitudes had served her well in some contexts, helping her provide exceptional service to passengers who she believed deserved it. But over time, these same attitudes had calcified into prejudices that affected how she treated passengers who didn't fit her narrow definition of respectability. The previous month, Sandra had received her annual performance review, which included several customer complaints about her attitude toward families with young children and minority passengers. Her supervisor, David Chun, had mentioned these concerns during their meeting, noting that Apex Airlines prided itself on providing exceptional service to all passengers regardless of their background or circumstances. The complaints weren't numerous, but they followed a disturbing pattern that suggested systematic bias rather than isolated incidents. One complaint had come from an African-American family traveling to a wedding, who reported that Sandra had been noticeably less helpful and friendly compared to her interactions with white passengers on the same flight. Another complaint involved a young Hispanic mother traveling alone with 2 small children, who felt that Sandra had been dismissive and unsympathetic when the children became restless during a delayed departure. But Sandra had dismissed these complaints as the whining of entitled passengers who didn't understand the realities of air travel or appreciate the challenges of maintaining order in a confined space. In her view, these passengers were simply looking for special treatment or attempting to use accusations of discrimination to get compensation or preferential service. She had convinced herself that her job was to maintain standards and ensure that first-class passengers received the peaceful, controlled environment they had paid for. Sandra had developed what she privately thought of as her passenger management system, a set of assumptions and responses that helped her maintain what she considered appropriate standards of behavior in her cabin. Well-dressed business travelers received warm, attentive service that included remembering their preferences and anticipating their needs. Elderly passengers and obvious celebrities were treated with deference and extra care that went beyond standard service protocols. But passengers who seemed to threaten the quiet, controlled atmosphere she worked to maintain faced a different level of scrutiny and tolerance. Young mothers traveling with babies fell into a particularly problematic category in Sandra's mental framework. In her experience, these passengers were often unprepared for the challenges of air travel, unwilling to take responsibility for controlling their children's behavior, and quick to complain when asked to address disruptions they were causing. She had convinced herself that sometimes harsh treatment of these passengers was necessary to maintain the peaceful environment that other first-class passengers expected and deserved. The irony was that Sandra's discriminatory attitudes were completely contrary to the values and policies of the company she worked for. Michael Williams had built Apex Airlines on the principle that exceptional customer service meant treating every passenger with equal respect and dignity. The company's employee handbook explicitly prohibited discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or family status, and required all staff to receive annual training on unconscious bias and inclusive customer service. But like many employees in large organizations, Sandra had found ways to rationalize her behavior and convince herself that her differential treatment of passengers was based on legitimate service considerations rather than unconscious bias. She had constructed elaborate justifications for her actions, telling herself that she was simply being more attentive to passengers who showed proper appreciation for good service while maintaining necessary boundaries with those who seemed entitled or demanding. As passengers continued boarding the flight, Keisha focused on getting baby 𝗧𝗵𝗲 settled for the long journey ahead. The 6-month-old had been teething for the past week, which had disrupted her sleep schedule and made her more irritable than usual. Keisha had prepared meticulously for the trip, packing extra formula, a variety of toys and comfort items, teething rings, and everything else she could think of to help keep 𝗧𝗵𝗲 calm and comfortable during the cross-country flight. The preparations reflected Keisha's natural thoughtfulness and her professional background as a pediatric nurse. She understood both the medical aspects of infant development and the social dynamics of traveling with children in confined spaces. Her experience working with families in stressful medical situations had taught her the importance of staying calm under pressure and maintaining patience, even when children were fussy or difficult to soothe. Keisha had also packed noise-canceling headphones as a courtesy gift for nearby passengers, along with small bags of candy, and a polite note explaining that she was traveling with a teething baby and apologizing in advance for any disruption. The gesture reflected her genuine concern for other travelers' comfort and her desire to be as considerate as possible while managing her daughter's needs. 20 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed to create a more restful atmosphere, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 began to show signs of discomfort. It started as mild fussiness that any experienced parent would recognize as typical infant behavior, but the pressurized environment of the aircraft cabin and the disruption to her normal routine seemed to exacerbate her distress. Keisha immediately began to practice routine that had become second nature during her 6 months of motherhood. She checked 𝗧𝗲𝗲's diaper, offered a bottle of formula, tried different holding positions, and gently bounced and rocked her daughter while speaking in the soft, soothing tones that usually help calm the baby. She retrieved a teething ring from her bag and offered it to 𝗧𝗲𝗲, hoping that the cold, textured surface might provide some relief for her sore gums. The crying continued despite Keisha's patient efforts, and she could sense the growing irritation of some nearby passengers. Robert Harrison, an investment banker seated across the aisle, glanced over with obvious annoyance before putting on his own noise-canceling headphones with exaggerated deliberation. An elderly couple in the row behind them, Margaret and Harold Stevens, whispered disapprovingly about the disruption to their peaceful flight experience. Keisha felt the familiar stress that every parent experiences when their child behavior becomes a public issue, but she continued her patient efforts to calm 𝗧𝗵 while maintaining her composure. She had dealt with similar situations before and knew that getting flustered or defensive would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. From her position near the galley at the front of the first-class cabin, Sandra had been monitoring the situation with growing irritation. She had been working first-class routes for over 5 years and had developed very specific expectations about the atmosphere and service standards that passengers in this section deserved. In her view, the crying baby was disrupting the peaceful, controlled environment that first-class travelers paid premium prices to experience. Sandra's irritation was compounded by her perception that Keisha wasn't doing enough to address the situation quickly and decisively. She had observed the young mother's efforts to soothe the baby, but in her judgment, these efforts were insufficient and poorly executed. A more experienced or competent parent, Sandra believed, would have been able to quiet the child within a few minutes rather than allowing the disruption to continue. After watching the situation for what she considered an unreasonable amount of time, Sandra decided that direct intervention was necessary. She had dealt with similar situations dozens of times throughout her career, and her usual approach was to apply firm but polite pressure on the parent to resolve the issue quickly or consider alternative seating arrangements that would be less disruptive to other passengers. Sandra approached Keisha's seat with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having her authority respected and her instructions followed without question. Her posture was rigid and her expression stern, conveying disapproval and impatience for what she saw as Keisha's failure to manage her child appropriately. She stopped directly beside Keisha's seat, positioning herself in a way that maximized her physical presence and authority. "Ma'am," Sandra said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of institutional authority, "you need to get that baby under control immediately. This is first class, and other passengers are paying premium prices for a peaceful flight experience. If you can't quiet your child, I'll have to ask you to move to a different section of the aircraft where the noise will be less disruptive." The words were delivered with the kind of practiced firmness that Sandra had perfected over years of managing what she considered difficult passengers. The threat of relocation was designed to motivate immediate compliance, while maintaining the facade of customer service professionalism. But the underlying message was clear. Keisha and her baby were unwelcome in first class, and their presence was being tolerated only as long as they didn't interfere with other passengers' comfort. Keisha looked up at Sandra with surprise and growing concern. She had been doing everything possible to soothe 𝗧𝗵, drawing on both her maternal instincts and her professional knowledge of infant care. The suggestion that she wasn't trying hard enough, or that she should be moved to a different section of the aircraft, felt both unfair and humiliating. "I'm sorry about the noise," Keisha replied politely, trying to keep her voice calm despite her rising stress. "She's teething and uncomfortable, but I'm doing everything I can to help her feel better. I have some medicine that might help, but it takes a little time to work." Her response was measured and reasonable, acknowledging concern about noise while explaining the medical circumstances that were causing 𝗧𝗵's distress. Any competent flight attendant should have recognized that Keisha was being proactive and responsible in her approach to managing a challenging situation. Sandra's expression hardened at what she interpreted as resistance to her authority. In her experience, passengers who offered explanations rather than immediate compliance were usually preparing to become difficult and demanding. She had learned to address such situations with escalating firmness to prevent them from developing into more serious confrontations that might require intervention from supervisors or security personnel. "I don't want to hear excuses," Sandra snapped, her voice rising enough to attract the attention of nearby passengers. "I want results. Either you control that baby right now, or I'll have both of you removed from this aircraft at our next stop. This is your only warning, and I won't ask again." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, transforming what should have been a routine interaction between a flight attendant and a passenger into a confrontation that was rapidly escalating beyond reason. Several passengers turned to stare at the exchange, their expressions ranging from discomfort to disapproval of Sandra's hostile approach. Keisha felt a surge of anger at the unfairness of Sandra's ultimatum, but she forced herself to remain calm for her daughter's sake and to avoid making the situation worse. Her years of experience as a pediatric nurse had taught her how to maintain professional composure even in highly stressful situations, and those skills serve her well now. "I understand your concern about the noise," Keisha said carefully, her voice steady despite the stress she was feeling. "But threatening to remove a mother and baby from the aircraft seems like an extreme response to normal infant behavior. I'm not being disruptive intentionally, and I'm doing everything medically appropriate to address the situation." Her measured response demonstrated both her intelligence and her professional background, but seemed to inflame Sandra's anger rather than defuse the confrontation. The flight attendant interpreted Keisha's calm, articulate reply as defiance and disrespect, confirming her belief that this passenger was going to be problematic and needed to be dealt with more forcefully. 3 rows behind this escalating confrontation, 𝗦𝘂𝗺𝗺 Williams sat quietly at his laptop, reviewing quarterly financial reports for Apex Airlines while listening to the interaction with growing concern and anger. He had been watching Sandra's hostile approach to his wife with increasing disbelief, recognizing that the situation was developing into exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that he had worked so hard to eliminate from his airline's culture. Michael's position as CEO gave him unique insight into the gap that often existed between corporate policies and actual employee behavior. He had implemented comprehensive diversity training programs, established strict anti-discrimination policies, and created multiple accountability systems designed to ensure that his company's stated values were reflected in every customer interaction. But he also knew that changing deeply ingrained attitudes and behaviors required constant vigilance and immediate consequences when problems were identified. Watching one of his own employees treat his wife with such obvious prejudice and hostility was both personally painful and professionally infuriating. The irony wasn't lost on him that Sandra was violating every principle that Apex Airlines stood for while wearing the uniform of a company built on the foundation of treating all passengers with equal dignity and respect. As the CEO of the airline, Michael could have immediately intervened and resolved the situation with a simple revelation of his identity. But he had learned from previous experiences that observing how situations develop naturally often provided valuable insights into his company's actual culture and performance. He decided to continue watching and documenting the interaction to understand the full scope of the problem before taking action. Michael's laptop screen displayed real-time customer satisfaction metrics from Apex Airlines flights around the world, showing the kind of performance data that had made his company one of the most successful in the industry. The irony of reviewing positive customer feedback while watching his own wife being harassed by an employee was stark and disturbing. Sandra's next words would prove to be among the most costly mistakes in aviation industry history. "You people need to learn some respect and control your children properly," she said, her voice dripping with contempt and racial animosity that went far beyond her professional frustration. The phrase "you people" carried unmistakable implications that revealed the prejudiced attitudes driving her increasingly hostile behavior. The racial epithet hit the cabin like a toxic cloud, making it clear that Sandra's hostility wasn't really about noise or disruption. This was about race, class, and the kind of systematic discrimination that had no place in modern society, let alone in the first-class cabin of a commercial aircraft. Several passengers audibly gasped at the blatant racism, while others pulled out their phones to record what they recognized as a potentially explosive situation. Keisha felt the familiar sting of racial discrimination that she had encountered too many times throughout her life. But her years of experience as a medical professional had taught her to maintain composure even in the face of blatant prejudice. "I'm not sure what you mean by you people," she replied evenly, her voice steady despite the emotional impact of Sandra's words. "But I'm simply a passenger traveling with my baby, trying to manage a difficult situation as best I can." The calm dignity of Keisha's response seemed to enrage Sandra further. She had expected anger, defensiveness, or capitulation, but instead she was facing someone who refused to be intimidated or demeaned by her hostile treatment. The psychological dynamic was similar to what often occurred when people accustomed to wielding unchallenged authority encountered those who wouldn't be easily dominated or silenced. "Don't play dumb with me," Sandra snarled, her professional mask completely slipping to reveal the ugly prejudice beneath. "You know exactly what I mean. People like you always think the rules don't apply to you, always looking for special treatment, and trying to cause problems when you don't get your way. But this is my cabin, and you'll follow my instructions or face the consequences." The escalation from professional disagreement to personal attack marked a point of no return in the confrontation. Sandra had abandoned any pretense of customer service and was now engaged in open harassment based on racial prejudice. Several passengers were now openly staring at the exchange, their expressions ranging from shock to outrage at the flight attendant's unprofessional and discriminatory behavior. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 𝗦𝘂𝗺𝗺, a young marketing executive seated 2 rows away, pulled out his phone and began recording the confrontation. As someone who had built a social media following by documenting instances of discrimination and injustice, he recognized that he was witnessing something that would likely have serious consequences for everyone involved. His finger hovered over the record button as he prepared to capture what would become one of the most viral videos in aviation history. Several other passengers were also reaching for their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing behavior so outrageous that it needed to be documented. The age of social media accountability had made it impossible for such incidents to occur without consequences, and everyone in the cabin seemed to understand that Sandra's career was about to be destroyed by her own actions. Michael's hands clenched into fists as he listened to Sandra's increasingly racist tirade against his wife. He had seen and heard enough to understand that this wasn't just poor customer service or an overreaction to a crying baby. This was systematic discrimination and harassment based on racial prejudice, exactly the kind of behavior that he had sworn to eliminate from his company through comprehensive policies and training programs. But before Michael could decide how to intervene in the situation, the confrontation escalated beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. Frustrated by Keisha's refusal to be intimidated and enraged by what she perceived as disrespect for her authority, Sandra raised her hand and slapped Keisha across the face with shocking violence that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The sharp crack of the slap was followed by a moment of stunned silence as passengers processed what they had just witnessed. Then the cabin erupted in gasps, shout of outrage, and the sounds of multiple phones being activated to record the aftermath of what everyone recognized as an assault. The sound seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, marking the moment when a bad situation became a criminal matter. Keisha sat frozen in shock, her hand moving instinctively to her cheek, where a red handprint was already beginning to form. Baby Zara, startled by the sudden violence and her mother's distress, began crying even louder than before, her wails seeming to echo the outrage that every decent person in the cabin was feeling. That assault, shouted 𝗬𝗵𝗲 𝗦𝘂𝗺𝗺, who had captured the entire incident on video. You just committed assault and battery in front of dozens of witnesses. Someone needs to call the authorities immediately and have this woman arrested. Margaret Stevens, the elderly passenger who had been quietly disapproving of the baby's crying just minutes earlier, stood up and pointed an accusing finger at Sandra. In my 65 years of flying, I have never seen such disgraceful, criminal behavior from an airline employee. This is absolutely unacceptable, and that woman needs to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Robert Harrison, the investment banker who had initially been annoyed by the crying, was now filming the aftermath with his phone while speaking into it like a news reporter. This is Robert Harrison aboard Apex Airlines Flight 447, and I have just witnessed a flight attendant physically assault a passenger for no reason other than her baby was crying. This is absolutely unbelievable behavior that demands immediate consequences. Sandra seemed to realize for the first time that her actions had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She looked around the cabin at the angry, disgusted faces of passengers who had witnessed her assault on a mother holding a baby, and the reality of what she had done began to penetrate her defensive anger. But instead of apologizing or attempting to defuse the situation, she doubled down on her hostile approach. She was being disruptive and disrespectful to other passengers, Sandra said defensively, her voice shaking slightly as she realized the magnitude of her mistake, but couldn't bring herself to admit wrongdoing. I was trying to maintain order in the cabin and ensure that all passengers could enjoy their flight experience. She refused to cooperate with reasonable requests to control her child. The attempted justification fell completely flat in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary. Every passenger who had witnessed the interaction could see that Keisha had been polite, cooperative, and patient throughout Sandra's increasingly hostile treatment. The claim that slapping a passenger was a reasonable response to a crying baby was so absurd that it only served to highlight the irrationality and prejudice that had driven Sandra's behavior. "You're insane," shouted a voice from the back of the first-class section. That woman was doing everything possible to calm her baby, and you attacked her for no reason. You belong in jail, not in a uniform serving passengers. Michael Williams had seen enough. The assault on his wife had crossed every line of decency, legality, and corporate policy that existed. He closed his laptop with deliberate precision, stood up from his seat, and began walking toward the front of the cabin where his wife sat holding their crying daughter. His expression was controlled, but everyone who looked at him could sense the barely contained fury radiating from his composed exterior. As Michael approached, several passengers recognized something familiar about his bearing and appearance, though they couldn't immediately place where they might have seen him before. His expensive clothing and confident demeanor suggested wealth and authority, but there was something in his eyes that made people instinctively step aside as he moved to the cabin with purposeful determination. Sandra noticed the approaching figure and turned to face him with the same hostile attitude she had displayed toward Keisha, apparently not recognizing that her situation was about to become infinitely worse. "Sir," she said sharply, her voice still carrying traces of the authority she believed she possessed, "I need you to return to your seat immediately. We're dealing with a disruptive passenger situation here, and I don't need additional complications from other travelers." Michael stopped directly in front of Sandra, his presence somehow making the spacious first-class cabin feel small and confined. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority that made everyone in the cabin strain to hear his words. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the obvious rage burning in his eyes was more intimidating than any shouting could have been. "My name is Michael Williams," he said simply, his eyes never leaving Sandra's face as he delivered the words that would destroy her life forever. "I'm the founder and CEO of Apex Airlines. That woman you just assaulted is my wife, Keisha Williams. My daughter, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 Williams, is a baby who's crying apparently justified physical violence in your mind. And you, Sandra Mitchell, are not just fired. You're going to prison." The words hit the cabin like a physical force, creating a moment of absolute silence as everyone processed the implications of what they had just heard. Sandra's face went from defensive anger to absolute terror as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a tsunami. She had not only committed assault on a passenger, but she had assaulted the wife and child of the man who owned the entire airline. The passengers who had been recording the confrontation suddenly realized that they had captured one of the most dramatic reversals of power in corporate history. The video footage of a flight attendant assaulting the CEO's wife will become legendary in business circles, a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice and the importance of treating all customers with dignity and respect. Sandra tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words that might somehow salvage the catastrophic situation she had created through her own prejudice and violence. But Michael held up a hand to silence her before she could begin whatever desperate explanation or apology she was preparing to offer. "Don't speak," he said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You've said and done enough already. Security will be waiting for you when we land, and you will be arrested for assault and battery. Your employment with this airline is terminated immediately, and I will personally ensure that you never work in the aviation industry again. More than that, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure that you face the full legal consequences of your criminal behavior." The finality of his words left no room for argument, negotiation, or mercy. Sandra's 15-year career in aviation was over, destroyed in a matter of minutes by her decision to let racial prejudice and uncontrolled anger override professionalism, human decency, and basic legal boundaries. The comfortable middle-class life she had built through years of service was about to be replaced by criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits, financial ruin, and the permanent stigma of being known as a flight attendant who assaulted a passenger and her baby. Michael turned away from Sandra without another word and knelt beside his wife's seat with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the cold authority he had directed toward the flight attendant. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, his hand tenderly touching the red mark on Keisha's cheek, while his other hand gently stroked their daughter's hair. His voice was filled with love, concern, and barely controlled rage at seeing his family attacked. "I'm okay," Keisha replied, though her voice shook slightly with the aftershock of the assault and the emotional impact of the confrontation. "Zara was just teething and uncomfortable from the flight. I was doing everything I could to help her feel better, but nothing seemed to be working very well." Michael's jaw tightened as he processed the full scope of what his wife had endured during what should have been a routine family trip. The physical assault was serious enough, but the racial epithets and systematic harassment that had preceded it revealed a level of discrimination that went far beyond a single employee's poor judgment. This was evidence of cultural problems within his company that would require immediate and comprehensive action to address. Standing up to address the entire first-class cabin, Michael's voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to speaking to large groups and commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words reaching every passenger in the section and carrying the weight of both personal pain and professional responsibility. "I want to apologize personally and profusely for what you have witnessed today. This behavior is completely contrary to the values, standards, and policies of Apex Airlines, and I want to assure each of you that appropriate action will be taken immediately and comprehensively." He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to the aircraft's captain, his words brief, direct, and carrying the unmistakable authority of ownership. "Captain Morrison, this is Michael Williams. We have a serious criminal situation in first class that requires immediate attention from law enforcement. I need you to contact the authorities and have them waiting when we land. We have an employee who has committed assault and battery on a passenger and needs to be arrested immediately upon arrival." The announcement over the cabin intercom came within minutes, the captain's voice carrying an unusual tension that suggested he understood the unprecedented gravity of the situation he was dealing with. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. We received instructions to contact law enforcement regarding a serious incident in the cabin today. Authorities will be boarding the aircraft immediately upon arrival to address this matter. We apologize for any inconvenience this situation may cause and appreciate your patience and cooperation." Sandra stood frozen near the galley, her face pale with the realization that her life was about to be destroyed by her own criminal actions. Other crew members gave her a wide berth, unwilling to be associated with someone who had just committed assault on the CEO's wife and child. The isolation was immediate and complete, marking her transformation from authority figure to pariah in a matter of minutes. The remaining 2 hours of the flight passed in an atmosphere of tense anticipation and fascinated observation. Passengers who had witnessed the assault continued recording and discussing the incident, with several posting updates to social media that began generating viral attention before the aircraft had even begun its descent. The hashtag Apex Assault began trending within an hour, accompanied by video clips and eyewitness accounts that would make Sandra Mitchell one of the most infamous figures in aviation history. Michael spent the remainder of the flight comforting his wife and daughter, while coordinating the response to the incident through a series of phone calls with his legal team, Human Resources Department, public relations specialists, and senior executives. The assault on his family was deeply personal, but his response would be professional, systematic, and designed to ensure that similar incidents could never happen again within his organization. By the time the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, the story had already been picked up by major news outlets and was being covered as breaking news on aviation industry websites. The combination of physical assault, racial discrimination, and the revelation that the victim was the CEO's wife created a perfect storm of public interest that would dominate news cycles for weeks. When the aircraft finally touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, it was met by a convoy of law enforcement vehicles, news crews, and Apex Airlines executives who had flown in from the company's Atlanta headquarters to manage what was clearly going to be a major crisis. Sandra Mitchell was arrested on charges of assault and battery, her hands cupped behind her back as she was led off the aircraft in full view of passengers and media cameras, capturing every moment of her public disgrace. The video footage of Sandra's arrest, combined with the recordings of her assault on Keisha Williams, will be viewed millions of times across television broadcasts and social media platforms within hours of being released. The story became a national sensation, sparking conversations about racism in the airline industry, corporate accountability, unconscious bias in customer service, and the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect regardless of their race or background. In the days immediately following the incident, Michael Williams used his platform as CEO and his company's resources to implement sweeping changes throughout Apex Airlines. New anti-discrimination policies were established with zero tolerance for prejudice behavior. Mandatory bias training was instituted for all employees at every level of the organization, and customer service protocols were completely revised to emphasize respect, professionalism, and equal treatment in every passenger interaction. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic or reactive. It was comprehensive and forward-thinking. 𝗦𝘂𝗺 brought in external consultants specializing in diversity and inclusion to conduct company-wide audits, established an independent ombudsman program to handle discrimination complaints, and created financial incentives for employees who demonstrated exceptional inclusive customer service. Sandra Mitchell's legal troubles extended far beyond the initial assault charges that had led to her arrest. She faced civil lawsuits from the Williams family seeking both compensatory and punitive damages, criminal prosecution that would ultimately result in jail time and substantial fines, and permanent blacklisting from the aviation industry through industry-wide databases that tracked employee misconduct. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle she had built over 15 years of airline service was destroyed by 18 minutes of prejudice and violence. Her home went into foreclosure. Her savings were exhausted by legal fees, and her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that she became unemployable in any customer service capacity. The viral videos of her assault on Keisha Williams and subsequent arrest ensured that her face and name would forever be associated with racism and violence. The incident also sparked broader conversations about unconscious bias, the responsibilities of corporate leadership, and the power of social media to create accountability for discriminatory behavior. Business schools across the country began incorporating the Apex Airlines incident into their curricula as a case study in crisis management, corporate values, and the importance of creating inclusive organizational cultures. For Keisha Williams, the assault was traumatic but ultimately led to positive changes that would benefit countless future passengers. She used her experience and her platform as the wife of a prominent CEO to advocate for better training and accountability systems throughout the travel industry, working with civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive programs designed to prevent similar incidents from occurring. Michael Williams' handling of the crisis reinforces reputation as a principled leader who was willing to use his power and resources to fight discrimination and promote justice. Rather than trying to minimize the incident or protect his company's image through public relations spin, he used the crisis as an opportunity to strengthen Apex Airlines' commitment to inclusive service and social responsibility. The incident strengthened rather than damaged Apex Airlines' brand reputation, as customers and industry observers appreciated the company's swift, decisive action and unwavering commitment to treating all passengers with equal dignity and respect. The airline's customer satisfaction scores reached record highs in the months following the incident, as passengers responded positively to the cultural changes and improved service standards that resulted from the crisis. The 18 minutes between Sandra's assault and Michael's revelation of his identity became legendary in corporate crisis management and customer service circles. The incident demonstrated how quickly situations could escalate from routine service issues to career-ending catastrophes when prejudice, poor judgment, and unchecked authority combined in toxic ways. Years later, when airline industry professionals studied the incident in training programs and academic courses, they focused on the importance of comprehensive employee training, strong organizational culture, immediate accountability for discriminatory behavior, and the courage required to stand up against injustice even when it might be easier to look the other way. The case became a powerful example of how justice could prevail when people with power and resources chose to use them responsibly, and how individual acts of prejudice could trigger systematic changes that benefited entire industries and communities. Most importantly, it demonstrated that discrimination and violence against innocent people would face swift, decisive consequences when witnessed by those with the courage and authority to act. The story ended not with revenge or retaliation, but with transformation and hope. Apex Airlines became the undisputed industry leader in inclusive customer service. Sandra Mitchell's assault became a teaching moment that improved training and policies across the aviation industry. And the Williams family's traumatic experience became a catalyst for positive changes that would benefit millions of travelers for generations to come. The incident proved that individual actions could indeed create systematic change when the right person was watching, recording, and ready to respond with both moral courage and institutional power. The 18 minutes that destroyed Sandra Mitchell's life became 18 minutes that transformed an entire industry, demonstrating that progress toward justice and equality was possible when people refused to accept discrimination as normal or inevitable. If you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race, background, or circumstances, then share this story with others who need to hear it. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination like this. Because the only way we create lasting change is when each of us commits to standing up against prejudice, supporting those who face discrimination, and holding accountable those who choose hatred and violence over humanity and justice.